Welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben. Today we're going to take a look at Low Fantasy Gaming Deluxe Edition by Stephen J. Grodzicki. So this is a rulebook, and it's a very complete one. It contains a lot of material that you would frequently find in 5th edition and some rules that seem a little bit like OSR stuff, kind of mixed together into a lower fantasy type of world exploration, fantasy gaming type of game. A little bit like 5th edition, but grittier, as it says here in the title. Let's take a look at what we get inside here. This is the Drive-Thru RPG edition, I believe. It is print on demand, and it looks quite nice. I think this is the premium color edition. That's what I would guess from the way that it looks. Quite sturdy. It is glue bound, but no real complaints about the way that it handles. I really like how it has this at the very beginning here. What is low fantasy gaming? Simple rules, fast and engaging combat, dangerous and gritty, and the core features over here. I really wish more role-playing games would do stuff like this because it very quickly gives you a sense of what you're going to be getting in this book, what makes it stand out. So things like it's going to be a roll-under system for attribute checks. You have your 9 classes, dangerous combat. There's a death and dismemberment table, or injuries and setbacks. There's rules for parties, retreats, and chases. You have rules for dark and dangerous magic, so magic can backfire and makes it a little bit riskier to use. Evocative spell names, which I quite like. Lots of GM tables, which is always really great. Basic description here of how to play. I love when they actually do a narration of what a session is like right at the beginning because it gets you into the right headspace and you get to see some of the rules working. So you get a quick sense of how the whole thing is going to work. And we start getting into creating a character. Before we get into this though, a quick shout out to today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Rackham Vale Paintbox Edition, now funding on Kickstarter. The award-winning Old School Essentials setting is back, but this time with larger paper, full color artwork, and a Smith sewn hardback format. Featuring the artwork of Arthur Rackham, the book includes an original map with 18 locations, 24 monsters, a handy factions chart, 63 adventure hooks, 7 tables for generating creatures and locations on the fly, and tons more. Back it on Kickstarter using the link below and get $5 off of retail price and 3 free bestiary cards. I think the first big sign that there is some old school inspiration here is the fact that when you're creating a character, it has an optional level 0 ordeal, which is essentially a funnel mission that we often see in Dungeon Crawl Classics. We start off as very low characters and you control a bunch of them and you run them through a dangerous scenario and a whole bunch of them die. Maybe one of them survives and that becomes your main character. It becomes like the backstory of your character. In terms of the attributes here, we have strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, perception, willpower, and charisma, along with luck. So our attributes are a little bit different than we have in standard D&D, but still pretty closely mapped onto it. You can roll your attributes, you can do point by, you have modifiers, and you have a score. Most of your ability checks are going to be done by rolling a d20 underneath your score. But there are some cases where you're going to be rolling a d20 and adding a modifier, in particular in combat. You have luck, which is a little bit like all of your saving throws put together. There are points that can slowly go down over time and that recover. You can also use luck for a bunch of other things. Some of our races include humans, dwarves, half-scorn, elves, halflings, your typical D&D races. Most of them don't really have a whole bunch of changes to your character, which I kind of like. They're mostly minor little tweaks. Our classes are, let's see, starting with Artificer. Does have a list of them right here? We have Artificer, Barbarian, Bard, Cultist, Fighter, Monk, Magic User, Ranger, and Rogue. And these are a little bit like 5th edition, or they remind me of it, in the sense that you pretty frequently get special abilities as you level up. And there's a wide variety of these. Your levels only go up to 12, though, as opposed to 20 in standard 5th edition. So the power level is kept lower. Things like Artificer, we have Alchemy and Mechanica, so you can start getting these special items or special devices. You can build new ones as you level up. It could be things like Corroding Spray or a Fume Mask or Hellfire Glass. Attack bonuses are over here. The chart is a little bit difficult to read, but you can see by level 12, you have a +8 bonus to your standard attacks. And that seems to be the general format for non-combat classes, whereas like a fighter would get 1 attack bonus per level. This does make non-combat classes pretty good at fighting, actually, versus some other OSR clones. For example, if you look at things like Lamentations of the Flame Princess, in that a wizard does not get any attack bonuses at all. because they're a wizard, and only fighters get +1 per level. This smooths things out a little bit more so that even if you're not really focused on combat, you're still, decently good at it. You're going to miss out on all of these special abilities that the fighting classes will have, though. Like a barbarian has not only a ferocious rage, but sixth sense and second attacks and things like that. We have rules for bards that can inspire greatness. They have a rallying shout, network of informants. Cultist is going to be your cleric-like class. There are rules for that later on, which I quite like because they do involve more integration of your particular god into your playstyle rather than just being a set of spells that you get, which is how a lot of D&D editions tend to do it. We have some sample gods here that you can use along with their tenets, what their patron benefits are, and things like that. So choosing your god is really going to make a difference there. Fighters get special abilities like adaptable and all sorts of different fighting styles here. Charger, dual weapons, long reach, deadly strikes, master of arms, second attacks. You can build a stronghold. Very old school right there. Magic users get your spell casting stuff. Monks get your pretty typical monk stuff, although it is written in I think a more condensed and a clearer format than we would see in 5th edition. And it does have, I think, a little bit more room for GM rulings, where it doesn't feel the need to spell every single thing out in extreme detail. The Game Master is given more leeway into just make sure that this makes sense in context. Rangers have different ranger type abilities like covering fire, Ranger's Ointment, Seasoned Explorer. They can be a good sharpshooter. Rogues sneak around and steal people and stab people in the back. One really fun feature that I haven't seen in other games of this type is you have these special unique features. And there is a whole bunch of different options here, but you are very strongly encouraged to make up your own. So every 3 levels, you get to create a special ability for yourself. And there's lots of options here, as I said, and you can look in other role-playing games. In fact, it advises you to look in other role-playing games for ideas and to talk to the Game Master and the other players to get one that makes sense and is not ridiculously overpowered, but still is very cool. I really like that because you are going to be able to make, very unique characters that way and ones that fit particular concepts that you have that may not be spelled out in the rule book. The skill system is pretty straightforward. It basically gives you a +1 bonus on attribute checks where you're rolling under, but it can also give you a reroll if you fail on a check that is related to your skill. It's a little bit like getting advantage. However, it doesn't work constantly. You have a limited number of these rerolls that slowly recover over time. Some skill options here, tables of party bonds. I do love how this book gives you lots of random tables. It gives you tons of content, and that covers a multitude of sins. If you can just give me lots of material that I can use in my game, that is going to be useful no matter what system I happen to be running. We have our rules for equipment here, common, uncommon, and rare items, and how likely you are to find them. One thing I found that was a little bit strange was that for being a low fantasy, gritty type game, there aren't any rules for encumbrance that I could find, which I found quite surprising, since that's usually a big part of these grittier type games. However, adding that sort of thing in would be very easy, I think. You could just give people a number of item slots equal to their constitution, or maybe their constitution plus their strength, if you wanted to be a little bit more generous. That would be a very simple way of doing that. We do have rules for buildings and construction here as a way to soak up lots of gold if your players happen to have a lot of gold. Your melee weapons and ranged weapons, these are pretty standard. They all have different properties or special abilities that can make them useful in different circumstances, which is nice. However, in my experience, players tend to just forget about this stuff unless you have them track it very carefully. We have our rules for running the game. Like I said, roll under. Combat has a number of different initiative variants, which I appreciate since everyone loves to do initiative a little bit differently. In itself, combat is very standard D&D, but one of the really nice tweaks that I liked was the fact that, actually there's some chase rules here, which are actually very cool. It does encourage retreating and chasing as a way to mitigate the fact that you can throw very dangerous monsters at players so that they have other options than just fighting it, which I think is smart. But martial exploits was the rule that stood out to me. This adds, whatever you want to call them, stunts, maneuvers into combat in a very straightforward way. And that's something that I'm always on the lookout for whenever I'm looking at the combat rules in different games, because I want ways for players to be creative in combat instead of just hitting back and forth all the time. And how it works is that anytime you hit somebody and you deal damage to them, then you get the opportunity to do a martial exploit every single time. So there's no choices being made here, because a lot of the time in these types of games, you have the choice between dealing damage and doing a maneuver. And oftentimes when that's the case, players are going to have a really hard time choosing the maneuver when they could be dealing damage. But this just takes away the choice and just gives it to them all the time. However, this does require a check, usually a strength check or a dex check, to see if that maneuver goes off. But you can be doing these every turn. And I would imagine that if players are taking advantage of that, then you're going to be seeing a lot of creativity in combat. The battlefield and the environment is going to be changing a lot as players are disarming each other and knocking each other down and things like that. There's also major exploits, which are a way to seriously hinder someone, like chopping off the wing of a dragon or blinding an enemy by stabbing them in the eye. In order to pull those off, you actually have to spend a point of luck. So it's more expensive to do those. The injuries and healing table includes a death and dismemberment table, which starts down here and then continues on to the next page. It would be nice if that was all on one page. Now, I see this a lot in games that are going for a grittier type of game, because you're going to end up with characters that have internal bleeding or broken ribs or damaged armor or pestilent wounds and things like that. However, in a lot of cases, it actually makes the characters more survivable, because instead of immediately dying, you're rolling on this table. Or rather, you do have to make a check. So let's say you get to 0 hit points, and then you're just out of combat. And at the end of combat, you approach them and see if they are dead or not, and they have to make a check. And if they are not dead, then they roll on this table. So that actually adds a level of protection that is greater than what you often see in old school games, especially the ones that I run, where you tend to just die at 0 hit points. However, this can lead to characters that are much more, beat up and scarred and ground up by the process of adventuring, which a lot of people like, and I can see why. We get into magic here. Anyone is able to sense magic just by paying attention and using perception. There is ability to do spell interruption. If you're damaged before you have a chance to cast a spell, then you're not able to, because you're just distracted for that turn. Dark and dangerous. There's a whole table here of bad effects that can happen if you cast dark magic, or really any kind of magic. And as you do it more and more often, the chance of rolling on this table goes up and up and up until one finally goes off, you suffer that effect, and then the chance goes all the way back down again and then slowly starts creeping up again. These can go anything from nothing happens to getting a foul beard of short rubbery tentacles to you becoming mute, or the third eye, you grow a fish-like eye in one palm, all the way up to some of the worst things like claimed, you get an effect that is permanent and never goes away. Or the stars align, your next spell within 24 hours causes maximum damage and or affects the maximum number of targets. So sometimes these things can be good as well. Fortunately, none of these effects seem to outright kill you. I have seen games like this where one of the effects is you die, which means that every time you cast a magic missile, you have a chance of just dying. And in games like that, that just incentivizes you to never use magic. This, I think, walks a little bit more of a middle ground that I like. We have divine rebukes. I love that there's a whole bunch of these for things that can happen if you are offending your god and not following their tenets. Things like the mark of shame, or the gift of truth. The cultist cannot intentionally lie for 1d6 months. Or cast out. The cultist suffers disadvantage on social checks as others instinctively shun them. You have to atone to get rid of these things. And there's lots of different rites of atonement. Like I said, lots of material for you to use. It doesn't just tell you to make stuff up, it gives you stuff. Spell list. These are pretty standard D&D spells, but they've all been rethemed and rewritten a little bit, and they all have really fun Vancian type names, like Abjure the Unnatural, or Rightful Ascension, or Sorceress Misdirection. It's a little bit more fun to shout that sort of thing than, invisibility whenever you're casting a spell. Advancement. Now, the odd thing about advancement here is that by default, it's basically session advancement or milestone advancement, which is very contrary to an old school style, which incentivizes players doing particular things in order to get XP to level up. Usually that's getting gold for advancement. That's not in here. Of course, you could very easily add that in. But you'd have to create XP tables for when those levels get leveled up, because those aren't in this book. You can steal those from other books pretty easily, though. I thought that was a little bit unusual, because it's not going to incentivize players to go adventuring and treasure hunting, which is the standard mode of adventure. It's not going to encourage them to do really much of anything in particular, actually, because you pretty much get advancements for just surviving. Maybe that's the incentive, just survive. That would work if you're throwing very dangerous obstacles at them. The GM tools section is quite extensive, which I appreciate. Most books don't include this many tools. And this includes everything from using black powder weapons to an extensive section on naval combat, along with different artillery effects and boarding enemy ships, skirmishing with them, crew versus crew, ramming them, withdrawing them. A whole system here, along with a whole bunch of different ships that you can use for naval adventures. Lots of different weird diseases. Most books don't include this sort of thing, but you can contract diseases and suffer their effects. Dungeon Room Generator. It's a D130 table. I would have loved to see a bunch of smaller tables with little bits of information that you could combine. This does recommend that you roll 2 times and kind of combine them in some way, but it is a good amount of material for you to use. We have some exploring rules, including how fast you can explore, what the weather is like. Weather tables are always great. It's less specific and than you would find in stuff for like hex crawls or even for dungeoneering. Things are just a little bit more vague. They don't have those procedures that old school games tend to have, which I think is a little bit of a missed opportunity, especially when you're doing dungeon crawling. There aren't rules for how far you can move each turn. They don't have that turn-like structure that things like Old School Essentials has that allows you to make dungeon crawling a more strategic, more tactical operation. Things are just a little bit more hand-wavy. There's lots of big random tables for different overland events that could occur or underground events. Voyage events, I guess if that is for traveling across the sea, and flight events. I don't know how often that's going to happen, but maybe you're on a long-term magic carpet or a dragon ride. And a whole bunch of random encounters. These are really great. These, in fact, remind me a bit of the random encounters that we've seen in books like Hubris, where it has different environments and then it has 20 different encounters, and not only with a particular monster, but what they're doing and how you might react to them. As I mentioned before, it would be nice if these were broken up into some smaller pieces like monster and activity that you could combine. That way you would have even more variety. Although I guess you could just roll 2 of these and take different elements of them. You have jungles, forests and woodlands, mountains and hills, oceans, plains and grasslands. Lots of great stuff for you to use, no matter what system you happen to be running. Information about hirelings, including how to build them really quickly with nicknames, backgrounds, quirks, and gear, catchphrases, traits, all of that good stuff. Madnesses that you can inflict on your players. And we have a system for mass battle. There's 2 different systems in here, which I think is good for the type of situation you find yourself in. If your party happens to find themselves in a mass battle, like they're actually in an army fighting alongside their friends, then what you can use is this party spotlight system, which will throw weird situations at them. Like there's a worthy foe that appears, or there's some innocents in peril, and they have to deal with these situations that show up in the chaos of the fight. And then there's another system that zooms out further and looks at what if players are actually running the battle themselves as a general, and it zooms out to a more war game level. There's also some sudden twists that you can throw in here in the middle of a battle. So here we have unit combat. We have different types of units, how their ranged combat works, how their melee combat works, how you can break units and keep track of their morale, all of that stuff. So heavy infantry, normal infantry, militias, dragons, all of them have armors and their move rating and morale trait. It's just a whole little mini game that you can use. A good deal of the book is taken up by the monster section, as you might expect. I love how there is a monster by hit dice and page, so you can easily find the different type of monsters that you need for your players. You want something really dangerous, go over to 10 hit dice, and you immediately know where to find those guys. I love how there is custom and improv monsters here. So you immediately have their hit dice, what their armor class, what their luck is, what their damage is. You can just grab those stat blocks, just this one line, and you have a monster that is good to go. You don't need to go into tons of detail with monster stats usually. For me, it's mostly about interesting abilities and attack patterns and personalities that get players to interact with them in unusual ways. Spending a lot of time on their exact hit points and things like that tends to not be a great use of time. This covers pretty much all of your standard D&D like monsters. You got minotaurs, rats, scorns, tentacle spawns, trolls, wasps, all your good stuff. When we get into NPCs and rival adventurers here, we have a morale system. It is a little bit unusual that the morale, the reaction table is all the way back here. I think it would have been nicer to have that more in the combat section because that's going to come up a lot when you're trying to break enemy morale. But it is mostly up to the GM decides when they do it. It would be nice if there was an actual rule for doing that. Perhaps they have to, do an ability check, maybe their wisdom or something like that, in order to see if they break and flee at certain critical points. And a reaction table here for seeing how people react to you when you first encounter them. This is a standard 2d6 OSR table there. This rival adventurers table reminds me of the thing we saw for monsters before, where you can create rival adventurers really fast. So you pick their party, Bard. What level are they? 3? Their AC is 11, their hit points are 15, their luck is 6, and here's a couple of special abilities and weapons that they have. You can do this for every single class, just grab them and go right away. The section on traps is actually quite extensive. You have your different rules for ruling how they find things, including a 3-second trigger, which reminds me a little bit of I think it's called the click rule that the Angry GM thought up, where they trigger a trap and then you give them like 1 to 3 seconds to pick what are you going to do, and then it goes off. So they have to dive to safety or roll or try and react to get away from the trap. We have simple traps, complex traps, different attack modes, different kinds of acids, alarms, deadfalls, drownings, all the different kinds of hazards that you might want to throw at the players, which is great for just as random tables for when you're building your own traps. What I would have loved to see is more trap designs that encourage player problem solving. Most of these are reactionary, including all of these complex traps over here. These remind me a little bit of Grimtooth traps in the terms of room-based, very elaborate traps, but there's not a lot of opportunity to figure them out. It does encourage you to put clues in there so you can get a sense of what might be threatening them, which is great, but they're less thinky and more reactionary. Also, one of the problems with these write-ups of the complex traps, even though they are very detailed, is that it's often hard to visualize exactly what they're saying because these traps are so complex. It would be nice to actually have little diagrams or pictures in the book here. I think that would be very helpful. Near the back of the book, we have lots of information about treasure, lots of different detailed write-ups for different kinds of treasure hoards that you can uncover. It is a little unusual, though, in that you're not getting XP for gold as you would in most old school games. And the problem with that is that you're going to have less of an incentive to get the gold. Still its own reward to a certain extent if you get a big pile of gold, but there's not a lot really to spend it on. I suppose you can build castles and other constructions, but apart from that, there's not a lot of major gold sinks in the game. So if the gold is being heavily guarded by lots of monsters, a lot of times you're gonna be like, is it really worth it? What are we gonna use that gold for? But you can still use these for other games. Lots of different magic items, and we got potions, scrolls, permanent magic items, some obvious properties that you can attach to things, like that it's intelligent or that there is a thunderclap attached to it. Discrete properties that they may have to discover over time. That's very nice, like that it's indestructible or that it gives you a deflection ability. A very brief roundup of what the setting is supposed to be like, and then we get into the spell name converter, where you can go from original spell names in early editions of D&D and into what it is called in this game, which is helpful if you're going to be converting things. An NPC generator at the very back, similar to the one we saw before, and we get our character sheets and our index. So who is this book for? I think it is probably best suited for either 5th edition groups that are looking to play a grittier, more old school style adventure, or perhaps a OSR book that wants to go in a little bit more of an elaborate direction where your characters are a bit more complex. You have a few more special abilities. I feel like it doesn't go quite all the way there in the sense that it doesn't have some of those essential pieces of OSR rules that make them feel like an old school game, especially things like gold for XP, like rules for dungeon crawling and things like that. However, there is a ton of material in here, especially on those random tables, that could be used in any kind of game. And I think it works as a decent bridge between 5e and old school for players that want to slowly move in one direction or the other. It is available on DriveThruRPG in PDF or in print form. As usual, I will put links down in the description below where you can check that out for yourself. And before we go, quick shout out to all of our new patrons that joined us last month. These patrons include Jason Weiss, Joseph Kraus, Justin Hardman, Alexander Price, Roman Akbarov, Garrett Davis, Joshua Kronk, Jake Fender, Jack, Byron McMullen, Zach Dwiggins, Ludovic Moj, Gray, Ron Watson, Lionel Barrett de Nazaris, Jack Timson the Snoipa, Pascal de Bruin, Nicholas Matthias, Icarus Crux, Kolya Kowal, Rudo, Art Basler, Richard Nash, Kent Smith, Reynard Ali, Charles Mass, Frank Dudek, Mason Till, and Jason Furman. Thank you so much for supporting the channel, and thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.